work that Humanities Texas does is just so important for the state. We just don't see many opportunities for institutions like Humanities Texas, the Texas State Legislature, and the National Endowment for the Humanities to sort of collaborate, work together, make common cause. And especially to start to see us kind of blow out those, I think, false boundaries between K to 12 and I guess whatever we would call higher education, 13, 14, 15, et cetera. So I really believe in these things. Once you are done with this webinar and with the others in the series, I desperately hope that you'll go talk to your colleagues, to your administrators, and maybe especially to your representatives, telling them about the good work that they do at Humanities Texas. I think now more than ever, this work is so important. And again, please do what you can to spread the good word, as they say. Okay, so I've just produced a lot of good feeling, I hope, some pep, some excitement about what we're going to do today. And now I'm going to completely kill all of that by doing something really mean and alienating. I'm going to give you, wait for it, a pop quiz. So here is what I'm doing. You should have 2 polls in your Zoom window. If you will quickly fill out those polls, 2 simple questions. Can you define close reading? And to your mind, which of the following is the most important factor in a successful close reading? So this should be, I believe Murphy can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think down at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should be able to see these polls. I'm seeing a thumbs up, it must be true. So we're gonna move quickly through these, but if you can just answer those 2 questions, I can sing the Jeopardy theme song or some circus music, whatever. I have a mandolin over here somewhere. But if y'all can get in there quickly, that would be great. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Excellent, y'all. Not surprisingly, as I would expect from this sort of poll, you can see that 3/4 of you feel as though you can maybe so define close reading. And we'll talk about why that is, why a simple phrase like close reading can lead to some lack of confidence about what we actually mean by that. There's good reason for that. That's nothing, it's not you, it's the thing. And we'll talk about why that is. The second poll, I think this is very revealing. To your mind, which of the following is the most important factor in a successful close reading? Many of you said patience. More than half of you said patience. I'm going to talk about why patience might be not just a virtue, but an essential part of the act of close reading. Excellent, y'all. Okay, so there will be more of those, alas and alack. I will continue to pop quiz you throughout the evening, but that's, you deserve it. You've been doing it to students for years. Here is coming back to you. Okay, y'all. So with that in mind, I want to begin with this image, and I want to begin with this image for a very clear reason. It couldn't have been taken yesterday because we are, many of us, virtually teaching and learning, but this should be a familiar image for you. We live, we're told, in an age of distraction. Thanks to various digital revolutions, we now have access to an immense, and I mean an immense amount of information at all hours of the day. The result is an overload of text and data, an experience of what my colleague Heather Hauser calls infowhelm, in which we're flooded with a seemingly ceaseless set of stimuli. With so much information at our fingertips, and with so many devices vibrating on or about our persons, we just don't seem to know how to pay attention anymore. Everyone from cognitive scientists to educational researchers to police officers and policymakers agree that our constant distractibility is a problem. I think you can especially ask high school and college instructors who regularly complain about our students' inability to remain focused on their reading assignments and lectures. In a culture that places a premium on reading quickly and reading superficially, students often and without compunction use the abbreviation TLDR, too long didn't read, to mark those moments where they simply gave up trying to read, much less trying to produce knowledge. In response to this purported crisis of attention, here's an image that I think is maybe indicative of what happens, what we think happens in our students' minds when they read. In response to this purported crisis of attention or a permanent state of distraction, a number of commentators have offered passionate briefs for why literature, broadly conceived, and I really mean that, broadly conceived, matters now more than ever. Part of a sort of wider defense of the humanities that I'm sure you all know about, it's been going on for decades now. Books like David Ulan's The Lost Art of Reading, Why Books Matter in a Distracted Time from 2010, and Alan Jacobs' The Pleasures of Reading in an Age of Distraction from 2011, argue that literature teaches us to be both better critical thinkers and more empathetic people. Relearning the quote-unquote lost art of reading can, they believe, help us to refocus our minds and through that process to regain our humanity. Now, while these are really charismatic, even inspiring claims, books like Ulan's and Jacobs too often preach to the converted. For example, Jacobs opens his volume, which I otherwise quite like, with something of what he calls a caveat lector. He says, quote, "Those who have always disliked reading or who have been left indifferent by it may find little of interest in this book. But those who caught a glimpse of what reading can give, pleasure, wisdom, joy, even if that glimpse came long ago, are the audience for whom this book was written," end quote. So I want to suggest that that's all well and good for the already initiated. That is, for the converted, those folks who are already on board with reading. But what about those skeptical or resistant readers who've yet to catch the glimpse that Jacobs describes? How can we help those readers, our reluctant readers, to gain a similar experience of pleasure, of wisdom, of joy, the three things that he says are possible in and through reading? So I and my colleagues hold that platitudes about the value of literature, however well-intentioned, do not in fact help students to become more attentive and thus more effective readers. Writers like William Shakespeare, Emily Dickinson, Toni Morrison, Sandra Cisneros can indeed offer pleasure, wisdom, and joy. But many readers initially find their works both daunting and difficult. The distractibility and those attention deficits so commonly lamented by educators and pundits alike are neither, we think, the inevitable effects of digital media overload, nor character flaws of young people today, that great category, young people today. We don't think that's true. I contend with my colleagues, and I've certainly found in my own extensive teaching experience, that students will devote sustained, critical, and even joyous attention to the most challenging task when they understand that task's purpose, when they're presented with a method for achieving that purpose, and when they can see the applicability of that method to other tasks and other aspects of their lives. So close reading, the detailed, sustained analysis of a small selection of text. And since many of you maybe so could define it, that I'll give that as my sort of definition of close reading, the detailed, sustained analysis of a small selection of text. Close reading has been at the heart of literary study for nearly 70 years. Although its origins are kind of messy, and we'll talk about this, close reading became a commonplace practice in the Anglo-American Academy following World War II and the rise of something we call the new criticism. And I'm going to come back to this image of these happy and potentially drunk men at a party in the 1960s, and their most famous book, one of the best-selling textbooks of all time, Understanding Poetry. We'll come back to this, but this is one of the places that close reading first was articulated and advocated for teaching, not just at the college level, but throughout the curriculum, really, believe it or not, K to 12. Several generations after Brooks and Warren's Understanding Poetry, after the new criticism, after the sort of instantiation of close reading in the Anglo-American Academy, it remains both a pedagogical given and a methodological mainstay, appearing in countless college classrooms and countless secondary school classrooms, as well as sort of on the pages of endless scholarly publications. Yet, although everyone agrees that close reading is widely and centrally practiced, No one has effectively mapped or systematically modeled what the practice of close reading is. And that's most of what I want to do today. Okay, so the rest of this will be quite chatty. I'm going to have three parts to my talk. The first will talk about close reading as a problem. The second is then going to think a bit about the promise of a technique that we've developed at the University of Texas at Austin called CRIT, the Close Reading Interpretive Tool, thinking about the problem of close reading, and then thinking about the promise of CRIT to respond to some of those problems. Then I'll end with a very brief meditation on a poem that I love before we take some questions and move into some digging into a close reading of our own. All right, let's talk about the problem of close reading. I should say the problems of close reading, which for many people are legion. Here are a series of complaints that I've heard, that I've said, that I've spoken over the years about close reading. Some common complaints about close reading include that it's hard, and especially that it's slow. Those things need not be mutually exclusive. This gets us, I think, to something fundamental about the practice of analysis, of interpretation. It's hard and it's slow, and it's designed in a lot of ways to be that way. We have these kind of romantic ideas about what reading and interpretation, what meaning making, really what study is supposed to be. For me, that's sort of caught for us in a whole visual cultural realm that really helps us to think, yes, reading is supposed to be this beatific, wonderful, romantic experience, that reading is supposed to be an escape from the world, and yet it's not always that way. Let's talk a little about its hardness and its slowness with, you saw it, a pop quiz. I'm going to shoot just a few more questions your way. Let's make sure this works. Wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. Boom. Two more questions for you. This is about the hardness and slowness of close reading. How confident are you about teaching students to do a close reading? And then how confident are you about doing a close reading yourself? We can talk about differences therein, but I think it's important for us to extract for a moment the difference between teaching students to do a close reading and doing a close reading ourselves. All right, let's wrap those up, y'all. Again, the music. Next time, there will be Jeopardy music, I promise. 3, 2, 1. Okay, y'all should be able to see this. Interesting. Okay, so very few, and this might be a self-selecting group, feel very confident about teaching students to do a close reading. But the majority feel that you're somewhat confident. The folks at the other end, neither confident or unconfident, I hope that by the end of the presentation, you'll feel a bit more confident in your teaching. But interestingly, you can see here that the confidence one has in the classroom sometimes follows our confidence, and here 45% feeling very confident doing a close reading yourself. So something about the translation of that to the teaching realm, to the classroom, many of you are feeling at a loss for. We'll talk about how we can build some of that confidence. Again, 42% feel somewhat confident, pretty close to mapping the somewhat confidence one feels teaching it. As you might imagine, I want to suggest that the teaching of close reading and the doing of close reading, our own close readings, don't always jibe. And there's a reason for that, not least because what we can do with a poem or with a passage by ourselves often feels natural to us because we've practiced so much as teachers. And yet, again, there's something baked into the process of close reading, or the lack of a process of close reading, that often makes it difficult to then translate that to our students, to encourage our students to have the same sense of control, the same sense of knowledge, the same sense of patience and confidence that we feel with our own close readings. Good, y'all. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Okay, so here's one of these romantic images one has of reading. This is Gerhard Richter. This is actually a painting, not a photograph. This is a photorealistic painting by Gerhard Richter from 1994. It's called Reader. I use this in many of my talks in all of my classes. It's a lovely image. It's also the end of a long tradition of painting, representing women as sort of romantic figures in painting while enraptured in a book. The sort of almost angelic light that is lighting on this woman while she reads. Again, a long tradition of representing what reading, what the experience of reading is like for many people. And yet this is not the experience very many people actually have. They are not sort of haloed in an angelic glow. They look a bit more like this. A wonderful image that I love by Gordon Ball called Cadets at Virginia Military Institute in 1991. This is what close reading feels like for many of us. A struggle, whether or not you're reading Allen Ginsberg. Not this image of beatific enrapturing, but here, the student, especially in the center, literally seemed like he's holding his brain inside his head because his mind is probably blown by Allen Ginsberg. He's also trying to make sense of it, and nobody looks very happy here. We might add a third image to this, which again is what many of our classrooms look like, a sort of full of distraction and the possibility for distraction. Okay, so it's with these, one thing we have to say here is that close reading immediately gets us into the difficult of the slow and the hard. And that's, again, part of its design. If it's the detailed analysis of a small bit of text, it's going to take a while and it's going to be difficult. That's its point. And yet this is something people often say of, as one of my students once famously said, close reading is hard reading. And that's exactly right. And what our work to do is to make that work less daunting for our students and to try to encourage them to slow down, even if, especially if they're distracted, and really focus on that small bit of text before them. Okay, other complaints. It's old-fashioned. It only works with poetry. And this comes to us really, I think, out of some misconceptions about what close reading is, but also to these images that I showed you earlier. That is Clenneth Brooks on the left and Robert Penn Warren on the right. They did a very famous image, a very famous textbook in believe it or not, 38 called Understanding Poetry, which several people have referred to as the most important literature textbook of the 20th century. It was so popular, it went through edition after edition. It's still available, despite being now decades old. It made millions of dollars for its two authors, who then went on to fame as literary critic and as a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and novelist. But when they wrote the book, they were just young assistant professors at Louisiana State University. And what they were trying to do was offer a way to think about, to approach poetry and literature more broadly that would be systematic. This came to be known as the New Criticism. It came to be known as an approach to literature and literary study that many people have said revolutionized the teaching of literature in America. Again, not just at the college level, but also at the secondary school level. So when we say that, it's only good for poetry and it's really old-fashioned, we have to say close reading on both counts is guilty. These are two old gentlemen, no longer with us. It is an old-fashioned approach. It is also begins really with the explication, with the sort of analysis of poetry. But as I'll suggest in a bit, it's not limited to poetry. And for all its seeming fustiness, part of it continuing to be with us, and this textbook continuing to be with us, is a testament to the fact that it still works. It's still highly functional. So yes, it might have started with poetry and it might be a little old-fashioned, but it continues to work. All right, last of these pop quizzes then. Final sentence. In your experience, what type of text is best suited to a close reading? And to your mind, what is the ideal length of a text to be used in a close reading? Okay, I will stop that. I have a nice microphone, so you can probably hear that even under my breath, I'm off tune, which is, I apologize. And in 3, 2, 1, I love when people change their votes. It makes me very happy. Okay, are we ready? 3, 2, 1. Excellent, y'all. Fascinating. Okay, this actually makes me very happy. Again, if the hit on close reading is that it's really only good for poetry. Your experiences say that's not true at all. And short fiction, I think, works beautifully in this context, as we'll see. But love also for oratory, for speeches, and for nonfiction. I'll just say that I tend to agree with your second responses about the length of close reading. I think 50 words, and I tell my students this often, you can do it, and you can certainly produce even an essay out of a 50-word or less passage. But I think 250 words is kind of the sweet spot. And we'll talk about why that is, but I think it ties to giving students some sense of choice or control over their literary selection. 500, several of you think that that's a good length. Again, probably the same principle. We'll talk about that in the Q&A, why 500 would work for you. I don't know that I would go more than that. I think 500 is probably a good cutoff. Again, if we're defining close reading as a detailed analysis of a small selection, anything over 500 words starts to no longer feel like a small selection. Excellent, y'all. Good work. Okay. This thing is slowing down a little bit. There we go. So again, it's old-fashioned, it only works for poetry. Your experiences push back on that sense of it only working with poetry, and that will be very helpful for us going forward. Finally, some common complaints. Oh, there we go. Everybody has a different way of doing it, and nobody seems to know what it is. And I think those are good problems with close reading. Everybody who has a different way of doing it is to acknowledge something that is endemic to the study of literature, that there a lot of personal preferences here. And although I will argue for crit, that what we've developed at UT Austin, I will also argue for a number of other approaches, and we'll see why that's important. We're not saying there's one answer. I think there are indeed multiple answers and really multiple ways to define what close reading is, how to approach it best. I'm going to give you just 3 quotations. I won't linger on these, just to emphasize this problem and maybe this possibility in close reading. Poet and critic, my old friend Joanne Diaz, argues that close reading, quote, is often invisible to students, and that our, quote, actual language surrounding close reading, which is often quite vague, might fuel this invisibility. So again, Diaz is saying even the way we talk about close reading in some ways helps to render it even more invisible for our students. The editor, translator, and complex professor, Andy Weeks, who's written with some of his own students, notes that close reading is, quote, self-evident to those in the know, but not to those in need of instruction. And finally, Jonathan Culler, a wonderful theorist, observes this about the sort of community of close reading folks, the folks who are in the know, as Weeks says. Close reading, like motherhood and apple pie, is something we're all in favor of, even if what we do when we think we are doing close reading is very different. So motherhood, apple pie, baseball, all these things, close reading is this deeply, it really is, kind of American thing, this thing we do in our classrooms. Although if we step back and look and compare, get some definitions as Diaz encourages us to, we might really be talking not just in different terms, but maybe in a different language about these things. So all of these are common complaints about close reading. And I want to acknowledge this. This is important for us to talk through some of the problems and really some of the baggage that you face as teachers. What I want to suggest is that you own all of this. It is hard. It is slow. Yeah, it's a little old-fashioned and fusty. Yeah, it really started with poetry, but as we just saw, it's not limited to poetry. Everybody does indeed have a different way of doing it, and no one seems entirely to have a complete definition, despite my small minor one, for what close reading is. Those are complaints. Those are problems. They're also opportunities for you in the classroom. The major opportunity, we think, is this thing we call crit. And I hope, I pray that several of you have taken this even webinar, had this content presented to you before. I hope that the rest of you were able to watch the crit video. If you weren't, you might as well log off now. Nothing will make, no, I'm kidding. Don't log off. I'm watching. Okay, nobody's logging off. Don't log off. Even if you didn't get a chance to watch the video, it breaks my heart a little bit, but guess what? That video is not going anywhere. You can watch it afterwards, and I think you'll still get a lot out of it. I'm not, though, going to reintroduce crit to you. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I think crit does. Again, if some of this slightly flies over your head, that's fine. Double back to it. Be sure to watch that crit video, which, again, you're welcome to also show to your students as well. Close reading interpretive tools, something we developed at UT Austin. It began as a way to reimagine our massively large general education core curriculum class at UT Austin. It's a class that everybody has to take in order to graduate from the university, or at least place out of. It is a non-major course taught at scale. We teach about 6,000 students a year in this course, and we get a ton of folks who never want to think about another poem or short fiction for the rest of their days. Lots of engineers, lots of nursing students, lots of folks who really would like to be somewhere else. We are deeply preaching to the unconverted in this class. In design and crit, we've reached about 20,000 undergraduate students. That is 20,000 undergraduate students from UT Austin over the last decade have used this as a centerpiece of their study of literature. Through a partnership with some shadow organization called Humanities Texas, it's also worked its way into a ton of schools all over the state, which we're very pleased with. Again, this is in the video, so I won't belabor it, but what we were trying to address were a series of questions that students tend to ask of a literary text. And this is both, partially in the secondary school classroom, but also just what students inevitably are headed toward in their initial interpretations, what they seem to want to do with the literary text, or more importantly, what they think they're supposed to do with the literary text. They want to know what the text adds up to or boils down to. They want to know about its universal themes, what symbols it uses. How does it make me feel? Can I connect it to my personal life? And finally, you know this one, is it going to be on the test? Those are the questions that students often ask of a literary text. And we think that that results in a certain set of answers or outcomes. One, it leads them to sort of leap to or rush through an interpretation. It produces a lot of symbol hunting, going out and trying to find, oh, this thing means that, let me go find that thing. A lot of me, myself, and I talk, a lot of, which we encourage in some ways, a personal response to and reaction to the text, but also a lot of sort of deeply idiosyncratic responses. Most importantly, or most urgently, we worry, students then often never fully make sense of how the text matters and means. What we offer instead is a way to interrupt that, to sort of ask students to approach literary analysis, close reading, through a methodical process. In working through a series of prompts, crit users are asked to examine a given text in multiple ways and from multiple angles. Our scaffolded, what we call multimodal approach, grants readers a sense of order, while also emphasizing different ways of knowing a literary text. Responses to one prompt often prepare readers for the next, but the responses may also encourage readers to revisit or even revise their previous responses. Again, this is the logic. Begins with paraphrase. So this thing is a little fussy. It begins with paraphrase, then moves to observe, contextualize, analyze, argue, and reflect. What we have found from, again, extensive tens of thousands of students and a lot of folks in other parts of the state responding to their experiences of this, responding to their one-on-one and really classroom-wide experience of crit. Here are some basic compliments that we get repeatedly. One, that it is indeed systematic. What can feel so daunting about literary analysis is it feels like your students will say, playing a game where you're trying to get in the head of the teacher or the professor to find out what they think the right answer is. It can often feel daunting and really Byzantine, sort of a maze-like to work your way through a literary interpretation. We constantly are told that students like that there is a system, a method to this madness of literary interpretation. Those, again, the steps, the process of a multimodal, multifunctional process that students can work through, in some ways like it were a math problem or like it were an engineering proof. It's getting here to some form of answer. Students really respond well to that method. Another thing, especially teachers like, is that it's adaptable and that it's free. That we strongly, there's nothing proprietary about this. We've made plenty of money off this. We're not trying to make money off this. What we're trying to do is get a method in wide circulation. So it's adaptable and it's free. You all are welcome to take this, adapt it to your own purposes, drop steps, add steps, do whatever you need to do. maybe just take the first couple steps, as we'll do this afternoon, this evening, and work those through in an analysis. That's absolutely fine. Again, you are encouraged to use this. All we ask, we've got a Creative Commons license on this. All we ask is that you not make money off of crit, and that you give us some credit. And at the bottom of the crit handout that you have, you'll see how to give us credit. That's all we ask. And again, we've seen remarkable things, especially from Humanities Texas teachers who've done a lot of interesting and creative things, including breaking up the 6 steps into 12 steps, 24 steps. One person even had 33 individual steps. And we will encourage, we can talk about that in Q&A, but we encourage that sort of creativity and that tweaking for your specific classroom and your specific pedagogical purposes. Again, you've seen the website, you're welcome to the video. We are working on ways to get you back into the crit site itself. That has to do with some problems with access EIDs, but if you are able to, you're welcome to use any of the text and materials up there, and especially use that handout and circulate that to your students. So what the site looks like inside. I won't belabor this, it works. We think that crit absolutely works, and we have lots of data that supports that. Again, I won't belabor it except to say that a ton of time went into analyzing initially whether this was a successful process of literary interpretation, and lies, damn lies, and statistics, as Mark Twain said, the statistics seem to be on our side. We've also got a ton of testimonials. This is one of my favorites, where students report to feeling like the concrete steps made the process more accessible and more objective. That going from feeling like things were frustratingly abstract, now it feels like there's something that's a learnable process, a reiterable process, something that students can do with any piece of literary text. Again, it's not just for poetry, and a ton of examples here. A nice excerpt from William Faulkner's Rose for Emily. I teach this all the time in my classes. Another one I teach a lot to pull out some of the density of the figurative language in Martin Luther King Jr. A wonderful extended metaphor from the I Have a Dream speech. This passage is wonderful to crit because it gets students to see how he's extending this idea of a nation's capital and cashing a check. Extended financial metaphor that King uses. We've also had good success using it in the visual realm. Here with Norman Rockwell's famous Moving Day, an image that we think can easily be and productively be close read, even though it does not have any written language in it. But one can take crit and apply it to the visual realm as well. Again, and because we think so highly of the fundamental and portable skill of close reading, old-fashioned though it may be, we think that crit, we get lots of compliments because it seems to, for many teachers and many students, give them an approach, a way of coming at this very daunting, but crucial portable skill. All right, I'm gonna skip this part so we can have a little more time for Q&A. Just a wonderful William Meredith poem that I will leave you. Murphy is gonna upload my PowerPoint so you can use these slides as needed, but a wonderful poem by William Meredith that I think perfectly captures what crit does. Poems are hard to read, pictures are hard to see, music is hard to hear, and people are hard to love. But whether from brute need or divine energy, at last mind, eye, and ear, and the great sloth heart will move. I think that's our work here, to help our students to get their minds, their eyes, and their ears, and their great sloth hearts, maybe their distracted great sloth hearts, to move. And we think that crit, and really any methodical approach to close reading, can do that work. You've got some hacks for crit that we'll talk about, things you can do with crit that will be helpful for you in your classrooms, including encouraging students to really take advantage of the fact that crit is a process that moves backward and forward, get them to move fluidly between them. You can break up, and I love doing this, break up the crit steps over time. Maybe on a Monday, you'll do steps 1 and 2. On Tuesday, you'll do steps 3 and 4. Maybe even do that over a week or a month. That can be very helpful for students. So they're really seeing how this step process works. You can also break them into small groups and have them do individual components and then come back together and see how the steps work or don't work together. have them produce the credible text, that is the text that they'll close read. That gets great buy-in from students. And again, breaking up, really taking ownership of this process and coming up with additional or alternative steps. You'll also have on my PowerPoint some further reading, which I think will be helpful, especially as we go forward. All right, y'all, I'll end the formal talk there and take any questions that you have, any comments, concerns.